Let your body settle now. Let the tension that has gathered in your shoulders across the long hours of the day begin to release, not all at once, but slowly, the way frost retreats from a window pane when the fire catches properly. There is nothing you are required to do in this moment. There is nowhere you are expected to be. Only here, in the quiet, where an old story waits for you, a story about a family, a name, and the extraordinary cruelty of being the wrong kind of brilliant inside the wrong kind of house. Breathe in, breathe out, and let the world you know dissolve slowly into the deep past of a continent that never quite existed, and yet somehow feels more real in its bones than half the history you were taught in school. The Westerlands are the colour of old coin. That is the first thing you must understand about the Lannisters, not their pride, not their ruthlessness, not even their extraordinary talent for survival, but the colour of the land that made them. A warm, tawny amber that catches the late afternoon light and turns the hills into something that looks almost sacred. The stone of Casterly Rock is threaded with veins of gold so fine that in certain light, when the sun drops behind the sunset sea and the shadows grow long, the whole cliff face seems to breathe with a faint inner luminescence. It is the kind of beauty that imposes. It does not invite you to sit down beside it and rest. It asks you to witness it, to acknowledge it, and then perhaps to be made appropriately small. House Lannister had been the kings of the Rock for thousands of years before Aegon Targaryen and his dragons arrived to collapse the map of Westeros into something new. The Casterly line, the ancient rulers from whom all Lannisters draw their name in a roundabout way, had held that seat since the Age of Heroes, since the time when the world was younger and the distance between legend and history was something you could cross in a single afternoon. Lan the Clever, the mythic ancestor, was said to have tricked the Casterlys out of their own rock, using nothing but his wits, sunlight, and a scheme so elegant that the Casterlys did not realise they had been dispossessed until the thing was already done. It is a founding story worth remembering, not because it is true, it almost certainly is not, but because it tells you what the Lannisters wish to be remembered as. They wish to be remembered as clever, clever above all else. And yet, across the centuries, the quality that came to define them in the minds of all Westeros was not cleverness. It was gold. Gold and pride. The Lannister words, hear me roar, were rarely spoken aloud by the time the main story begins, because the Lannisters had long since replaced their words with something more penetrating. A phrase that had attached itself to the family the way barnacles attach to rock, without ceremony and without invitation. A Lannister always pays his debts. Not a motto of aspiration, a statement of threat dressed in the language of honour. It told everyone exactly what they needed to know. Whatever you are owed, you will receive. Whether that is gratitude or ruin depends entirely on which side of the ledger you occupy. It is worth pausing here for a moment, breathing slowly, because what we are really talking about when we talk about the Lannister legacy is the way a family can become trapped inside the story it tells about itself. The Lannisters were not always wealthy. There were centuries when the mines ran thin, when the gold threads in the rock narrowed to nothing, and the family survived on pride and the memory of what they had been. They endured, and then the mines reopened and the gold poured forth again, and the whole edifice of Lannister supremacy rebuilt itself around the simple, intoxicating fact of money. But by then, the armour was already on. The performance was already underway. A Lannister does not show weakness. A Lannister does not beg. A Lannister does not weep in a place where another living soul might see it happen. There is a history of the Westerlands that runs underneath the more famous history. The history not of the lords who sat at Casterly Rock, but of the land itself, the long slow record of the hills and the seacoast, and the particular quality of the light in different seasons, the way winter comes to the Westerlands differently than it comes to the north, without the savage duration of the true northern winters, but with a grey, persistent dampness that settles into stone and bone alike and refuses to be fully dispelled until late in the following year's turning. The small folk of the Westerlands have proverbs about this weather that the lords do not know, proverbs that have accumulated over generations of experience with the specific character of their particular corner of the world. The lord in his castle thinks of the Westerlands as gold. the farmer in his field thinks of it as grey. Both are looking at the same land and seeing it accurately from their respective positions, and the gap between those two accurately seen realities is itself a kind of education in how power works. The rock itself is the centre of everything, spatially and psychologically. Larger than any castle in Westeros, larger than any structure that human hands had built in the known world at the time of the main story, it is not simply a castle in the conventional sense, a fortified structure built to defend a strategic point, but something more total than that, a mountain that has been made into a dwelling over so many generations that the made and the natural have become impossible to separate. The halls that Lannister lords have walked for 1,000 years are carved directly into the living stone of the mountain, the corridors following geological features that the original builders found and then expanded, so that the rock has grown organically, the way a city grows, filling available space with whatever the current generation needed, leaving behind what the previous generation had built, so that walking its corridors is like walking through a history of human habitation compressed into stone. Tyrion knew those corridors with his body rather than his mind, knew them in the way that places you have moved through since childhood inhabit you, rather than being remembered, so that your feet know the turn before your eyes find it in the dark. The gold in the rock is threaded so finely through the stone in places that it is not visible until the torch catches it at the correct angle, and then it blazes briefly with an intensity that seems disproportionate to its actual volume, as if the gold is not merely reflecting the light but recalling previous lights, all the torches and candles and lantern flames that have passed across it in 10,000 years of habitation. This quality, of being capable of intensity that outpaces volume, was itself a Lannister quality, visible in the family across generations. They burned brighter than their actual numbers or their actual military strength could quite account for. The gold did things in the mind that raw iron could not do, and the Lannisters had understood this since before they could articulate it, had built their entire political philosophy around the exploitation of the gap between appearance and actuality, between the fire that the gold reflected and the modest volume of the metal that produced it. Into this house, this beautiful, gilded, suffocating house, Tyrion Tybalt Lannister was born, in the year 281 after Aegon's conquest, on a night that his father Tywin would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The child arrived at the cost of his mother's life, which was not, in the cold arithmetic of Westerosi noble families, an entirely unusual occurrence. Women died in childbed regularly, and the grief of it was real, and the grief of it was expected to be private, and the grief of it was expected to resolve itself within a period of mourning, and then be set aside so that the family could continue. What was unusual, what was devastating in a way that changed the entire gravitational field of the family forever after, was the nature of the child who survived. He was a dwarf, misshapen by the standards of a world that measured worth in the length of a man's sword arm. His head too large, his legs too short, his eyes mismatched, one green, one black, in a way that people with a gift for cruelty found grotesque, and people with a gift for observation found fascinating. Tywin Lannister looked at his son and saw the ledger of his family's dignity being entered against him. He looked at the child and he saw a joke, told at his own expense, by a universe that he had spent his entire life trying to bully into obedience. He did not abandon the boy. He was too disciplined for that, too committed to the performance of lordly competence to allow himself a gesture that could be interpreted as weakness. But he made it clear, through the accumulated architecture of small cruelties, the refusals, the silences, the comparisons, the withholdings, that Tyrion would not inherit the rock, would not carry the family name forward, would occupy a kind of useful but diminished role in the Lannister story, a footnote, a cautionary appendix. And Tyrion, who was 3 years old, and then 5, and then 9, and then 12, absorbed all of it. He read it in the set of his father's jaw, in the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when he entered it, in the way servants looked at the floor when he passed. He absorbed it, and he did something with it that Tywin never anticipated, never counted in his calculations, perhaps never even perceived. He turned it into fuel. The thing that was meant to diminish him became the thing that refined him. He read every book in Casterly Rock's considerable library, not because he was told to, not to prove something to anyone in particular, but because books did not flinch when he entered the room. Books did not look at him and make a quick calculation about his value. Books simply opened, and inside them was everything anyone had ever thought worth recording. And Tyrion moved through that accumulated knowledge the way a man moves through a house he has always lived in, comfortable, unhurried, certain of the geography. His sister Cersei was beautiful, and she knew it, and she had learned to use it the way a soldier learns to use a weapon, efficiently, without sentiment, with an eye always toward the optimal application of force. His brother Jaime was beautiful and strong and easy in the world in the way that people who are beautiful and strong are frequently easy in the world, as though the world had been built to accommodate them specifically, and they had merely arrived to take possession. Tyrion was neither of these things, and so he became something else. He became the one who watched. He became the one who listened at doors and around corners, and through the long, slow meals where great men said things they assumed were private because the dwarf at the end of the table was surely not paying attention. He always was. He always had been. This is where the Lannister legacy becomes complicated and interesting, and, if you let yourself sink into it on a quiet night like this one, quietly devastating. Because the family had built itself around a myth of cleverness. Lan the Clever, the family that outthought its enemies, that survived through wit when brute force would have failed. And then the family produced, in its most famous generation, a son who embodied that myth more completely than any Lannister in living memory, a mind that could read a room faster than any spy, dismantle a political argument faster than any counsellor, see 3 moves ahead in any game that mattered, and the family could not receive him. The vessel was wrong. The gold was in there, unmistakably shining, but it had arrived in a shape the family did not know how to hold. And so the rock closed around it and pressed, and a different kind of story began. Not the story of the cleverest Lannister. The story of the one who had to be clever enough to pretend that he was not. Let your breath slow. The fire in this imagined hearth burns low. The gold threads in the stone above you catch the last of the light, and then the room grows dark, and there is nothing required of you now except to rest. The legacy is an old thing. Heavy. Let it settle on the floor beside you, not on your chest. It will keep until morning, and so will you. Settle again now. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Feel the small release that happens when you stop holding yourself up and simply let yourself be held. The night is patient. The story is patient. There is no urgency here, no debt that falls due before morning, only the soft drift of an old history pulling you gently downward, the way deep water pulls without malice, simply by being what it is. Breathe, and let us speak of fathers for a moment, because to understand Tyrion Lannister's brilliance, we must first understand the man who could not see it, the man whose own considerable intelligence cast a shadow so long and so cold that everything underneath it grew in strange, sideways directions, reaching always for a light that never quite arrived. Tywin Lannister was, by almost any measure that the world of Westeros could apply to a man, an extraordinary success. He had taken a family that his own father Titos had spent 20 years slowly humiliating, through indulgence, through weakness, through the deeply embarrassing spectacle of a great lord who laughed at himself and forgave his enemies, and lent money to men who would never repay it. And he had rebuilt that family into something the entire continent feared. Not respected. Feared. Tywin understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had watched weakness destroy what he loved, that fear was more reliable than love. Love was contingent. Love depended on continued performance, on continued generosity, on the maintenance of the qualities that had inspired it. Fear, properly installed, required only maintenance. It could survive long absences. It could survive rumour and reversal. It could survive almost anything except its own complete refutation, and Tywin spent his entire political career ensuring that refutation never came. The Rain Tarbeck affair was where Tywin made himself into a lord that other lords could not look away from. He had been barely 20 years old when he received word that Lord Roger Rayne of Castamere and Lord Walderan Tarbeck had risen in rebellion against his father's house, a rebellion that Titos, true to his gentle and catastrophic nature, had allowed to fester through years of accommodation and half-measures. Tywin marched. What followed was not a campaign, it was a demonstration. The Tarbeck seat fell first, and with it every person who had chosen the wrong side of that equation. Castamere was next, and when it was done, Tywin had the mines flooded so that the castle became a tomb, and the rains that came after filled the tunnels and the halls, and a song was written about it that people would hum under their breath for generations as a reminder of what the Lannisters did to houses that forgot their place. And the rains of Castamere fell, and they continued to fall, in every subsequent calculation made by every lord who might have considered defiance. Tywin never needed to flood another castle. The precedent held. That is the thing about a truly effective act of terror. It works in retrospect across decades, even across generations, because the story of it does the work after the event has concluded. Tywin was brilliant enough to understand this, and disciplined enough to maintain the associated reputation through everything that followed, including the much later sacking of King's Landing, including the Red Wedding, including every subsequent atrocity that the histories would attach to the Lannister name. He was not a man who shrank from the weight of what he had done. He wore it. He considered it his most important garment. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. The particular architecture of the man. Because Tywin did not enjoy cruelty, which is an important distinction, and one that people who reduce him to simple villainy tend to miss. He was not cruel because cruelty gave him pleasure. He was cruel because cruelty was a tool, and he was an exceptionally pragmatic man who used whatever tools were available to him to achieve the outcomes he required. He experienced love, genuinely, for his wife Joanna. He experienced something approaching warmth for Jaime and for Cersei. He experienced ambition for his family that was so profound it had consumed his sense of himself as a person separate from that ambition, so that by the time we encounter him in the main story, it is genuinely difficult to say where Tywin Lannister ended and House Lannister began. He had made himself into the institution he served, and that merger left no room for a son like Tyrion. Tywin's relationship with his own father was the template from which he built his entire subsequent political philosophy. Lord Tytos Lannister was not a cruel man. He was not a foolish man, exactly. He understood the world well enough, at the conceptual level, to know what it required. What he lacked was the capacity to enforce. He was a man of genuine warmth who found it genuinely difficult to maintain the required adversarial stance against the men who owed him service and occasionally defied him. He forgave too readily. He laughed at himself too easily. He accepted terms that a stronger lord would not have accepted, and when the terms were subsequently ignored, he accepted the next set of terms, and the pattern accumulated until the Lannister reputation had been damaged in ways that required his eldest son to spend a decade repairing them through methods that would have horrified his father. Tywin had watched this. He had watched his father negotiate away the family's dignity in a dozen small transactions, each one individually defensible, together constituting a disaster. And he had resolved, with the absolute clarity of a young man who has found the thing he is most determined never to become, that he would be the opposite. He would be so utterly the opposite that the ghost of his father's weakness would be exorcised permanently from the Lannister name. He would make the name mean something that could not be laughed at, could not be defied without consequence, could not be softened by the warmth of the man who bore it. He would make the name harder than the man. He succeeded spectacularly, and the cost of that success was that he had to become less than the man to make the name more than the man, had to hollow out the interior to make the exterior more impressive, had to sacrifice the capacity for genuine relationship, the capacity his father had perhaps too much of, in service of the reputation that his father had allowed to erode. The particular grief of Tywin's life, the grief beneath the armour and the reputation and the 40 years of carefully maintained dominance, was that the man who had preceded him had a quality that all that dominance could not replicate and could not replace. Tytos Lannister was loved. Not by the lords who defied him, they held him in contempt, which is not love and does not resemble it, but by the people immediately around him, by the men who served him closely and the family members who depended on him. He was genuinely loved, in the ordinary, uncomplicated way that people love those who are warm with them and treat them as human beings and occasionally laugh at themselves in their presence. This love had been insufficient to protect the family's political standing, which was a real and significant failure. But its absence from Tywin's world, the fact that the people around him feared him and respected him and depended on him and were not permitted to love him, was also a real and significant failure of a different kind, a failure that Tywin categorised under necessary cost and filed away, and was not, from all available evidence, capable of fully mourning. What Tywin valued at the cellular level was the impression of power. Not merely power itself, though he valued that too, valued it deeply, but the impression of it, the public performance of strength and competence and controlled dominance that made other men and women feel in his presence that they were standing near something larger than themselves. He was extraordinarily tall. He dressed in ways that emphasized the gold of his family's sigil. He spoke rarely and precisely, which meant that when he did speak, rooms rearranged themselves to hear him. He had cultivated, over decades of practice, a quality of stillness that people misread as calm, but was actually something more calculated. The stillness of a large animal that has no natural predators and therefore does not waste energy on unnecessary movement. Into this precise, controlled, performative world, Tyrion arrived as a kind of perpetual violation. Not because he was unintelligent. Tywin was far too intelligent himself to be unaware of his younger son's considerable mind, but because the package was wrong. A Lannister who commanded rooms did so through physical presence, through the implicit reminder that behind the gold and the words was a capacity for violence that the family's history made entirely credible. Tyrion was small. He was jested at by strangers and courtiers, and even, occasionally, by his own sister. He arrived in a room, and people looked down at him, physically, which meant they were already in the wrong relationship to him before a single word had been spoken. Tywin could not figure out how to project Lannister supremacy through a vessel that everyone's first instinct was to look down upon, and so he did not try. He assigned Tyrion to the drains. Lord of the Drains and Cisterns, Master of Coin in the city's waste management. The appointment was an insult with a title. Tywin made it not out of malice exactly, but out of something perhaps more damaging, a genuine failure of imagination. He could not see a path by which Tyrion served the family's image, and so he did not look for one. He filed the problem away in the place where he stored the things he had decided not to think about, alongside the memory of Joanna's death, and the growing suspicion about Cersei and Jaime and all the other things that a man with sufficient willpower could hold at arm's length indefinitely. What Tywin missed in this filing away was the thing that would eventually matter most. He missed that Tyrion, precisely because he had been assigned to the margins, had developed an understanding of the machinery of power that his father, always at the centre of it, had never quite acquired. Tywin understood power from above, how to issue commands, how to enforce consequences, how to maintain a reputation that made enforcement necessary as rarely as possible. Tyrion understood power from the side, from below, from the angles that important men never bothered to look at because they did not imagine that anyone they needed to worry about might be looking back from there. He understood what the servants thought. He understood what the minor lords thought in the moments before they composed their faces for the great lord's arrival. He understood the gap between what powerful people believed their image projected and what people actually felt in their presence. It was an education unavailable to anyone born in the centre of power, and Tywin had placed him there in that liminal space by underestimating him. The cruel irony is that this is precisely the kind of strategic thinking that Lan the Clever would have recognised. The founding myth of the family is a story about a man who triumphed by operating from outside, by seeing what the people at the centre of the castle could not see, and here was Lan's truest heir, forced into that exact position, developing that exact capability, and the man who claimed to be the greatest living steward of the Lannister legacy could not perceive it, because he had already decided what Tyrion was, long before Tyrion was old enough to demonstrate otherwise. The fire settles. The embers breathe orange and then a cooler red. Outside this quiet, imagined place, the cold of the Westerlands wraps the hills in a silence that has held for a very long time. You do not need to understand everything tonight. The understanding accumulates the way the gold accumulated in the rock, slowly in thin veins, over time that cannot be hurried. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the man and his shadow thin out. Become something you can carry lightly as you drift further toward the quiet end of the night. There is a particular kind of grief that exists in the history of a person before that person is old enough to understand what grief is. A wound inflicted before any vocabulary exists to describe it. Before there is any architecture of selfhood strong enough to receive the blow and process it and file it somewhere it will not eat the house from the inside. You know this kind of grief, perhaps, in some form. Most people do. It arrives not as an event but as a condition, a weather pattern that was already the climate of the world when you were born into it, so that for a long time you do not think of it as unusual. You think of it as simply the way things are. Breathe slowly now, and let us enter the most tender part of Tyrion Lannister's story, the part that precedes his cleverness and his wit and his extraordinary political mind, and simply rests at the origin of the man, which is to say, at a loss. Joanna Lannister was, by all accounts that survived her, a remarkable woman. Not in the sense that histories tend to describe remarkable women. She was not a warrior queen, not a political schemer in her own right, not a person who set wars in motion or redirected the course of kingdoms. She was remarkable in a quieter way, the kind of remarkableness that is harder to record and therefore more easily lost. She was said to be clever, genuinely clever, in a family that valued cleverness as mythology, but was often suspicious of it in practice. She was said to have a warmth that softened the edges of Tywin's particular ferocity, that created around their small family a domestic atmosphere that was, within the iron constraints of the man she had married, something approaching tender. Tywin loved her. This is not in doubt, and it is worth lingering on because it complicates the portrait of the man considerably. The person who orchestrated the flood at Castamere, who would later sanction the Red Wedding, who ran the kingdom of the elderly and addled heiress with the precision of a man who believed chaos was a personal insult. That person came home to someone he loved, genuinely, without calculation, without the professional dimension that coloured every other relationship in his life. Joanna Lannister was the one unguarded place in a man who had otherwise surrounded himself in armour so thoroughly that the armour had become the man. When she died, the armour closed completely over that space, and there was no longer any unguarded place at all, and no one alive inside the castle who could reach him. She died bearing Tyrion. The masters who attended the birth recorded it with clinical efficiency. The labour was difficult, the positioning of the child complicated, the bleeding that followed uncontrollable. Within hours of the boy's arrival she was gone. Tywin was not present. Great lords were not present for the physical catastrophe of childbirth in the way that such things are sometimes reimagined in later accounts. He received the news in the way that men of his particular formation received devastating news, without visible collapse, without the public abandonment of composure that would have felt to him like a further defeat. He walked into the room where his wife's body lay, and he looked at his son, and what he saw in that moment, in that specific combination of grief and rage and the particular helplessness of a man who could not punish the thing that had hurt him, was something that could never quite be undone. He is said to have looked at Tyrion and remarked that the child was half the size he expected. It is a cold thing to say. It is the kind of thing a man says when he is keeping his composure at considerable cost, when he's using whatever small brittle pieces of distance he can find to hold himself together, and in that moment the thing that offered him distance was the child's obvious physical difference. The misshapen head, the short limbs, the mismatched eyes. He focused on the wrong thing, and the wrong thing became, over time, the thing he could not stop looking at. The early education that Tyrion received was, in its formal dimensions, the same education that any son of a great house received. The letters and the numbers, the histories of the 7 kingdoms and the major houses, the rudiments of military strategy, the genealogies that were as much political documents as family records. A tutor came and went and came back, and Tyrion processed the material at a pace that made the tutor uncomfortable, in the specific way that very intelligent students make mediocre teachers uncomfortable, by consuming the material faster than it can be provided, and then sitting there, waiting, with a quality of patience that is indistinguishable from politeness, but contains, underneath it, a mild, continuous irritation at the pace. He read ahead. He read beyond the curriculum. He found the discrepancies between different historical accounts, and noted them in the margins of the text in a small, precise hand, and the marginalia accumulated over years of reading into a secondary text of its own, a record of a young mind finding the gaps in the official version of things and making careful note of each one. Jaime was the person who made childhood survivable. This is a thing that is easy to understate and important not to. The texture of daily life in a house where your primary guardians regard you as a problem is a texture of continuous, Low-level attrition, the endless small reminders, mostly non-verbal, that your presence is not exactly welcome, that the room rearranges itself slightly against you whenever you enter it, that there is nowhere quite where you fully belong. Jaime cut through this texture with the simple, clean directness of a person who had never learned to maintain the required social distance, and did not see why he should. He told Tyrion jokes. He taught Tyrion to ride at an age when most people assumed Tyrion's physical configuration made riding impossible, spending patient, often frustrating, occasionally dangerous hours in the yard finding the configuration of saddle and position that would work. He included him. In the particular language of childhood, inclusion is everything, and Jaime offered it without apparent calculation, which made it the most valuable thing he possessed. The wound of the beginning shaped Tyrion's relationship with love in ways that did not become fully visible until much later, in the contexts where love was at stake, and the old wound's influence could be felt in the specific character of his fear. He loved intensely and guardedly simultaneously, in the way of a person who wants very much to trust, and has been given substantial evidence that trust is dangerous. He was drawn to people who were themselves somehow marginal, somehow outside the circle of fully received persons, people who had been used by the world and still maintained their capacity for genuine warmth despite the using. In these people, he recognized something he understood from the inside, and the recognition was the basis of the specific, complicated affection that was the best Tyrion Lannister could offer, which was, when it arrived, considerable. It is worth pausing here, simply pausing, because what we are watching from the distance of the reader and the long perspective of history is a grief response that became a character. Tywin Lannister looked at his son and could not separate the son from the death, and the grief curdled into something harder and colder and more durable than grief, and that hardened thing became the primary medium through which Tyrion Lannister experienced his childhood. He was raised, in a sense, inside his father's unresolved mourning. He grew up in the cavity that his own birth had created, and he had no way of knowing this for years, no language for it, no framework within which to understand why the man at the head of the table looked at him the way that he did. His sister Cersei filled the absence of their mother in a specific way by constructing a mythology around her that served Cersei's particular emotional needs, a mythology of the perfect, beautiful, golden Lannister queen who had been cruelly taken from them by the monster at the end of the table. This is a hard thing to write and a harder thing to read, and we do not linger on it longer than necessary, but it shaped the texture of Tyrion's childhood with the kind of persistent low-level poison that is more damaging over time than any single acute wound. He was the thing that had taken something irreplaceable. He had not chosen this. He had not performed any action to earn this designation. He had simply arrived at cost, and the cost had been calculated and attached to him, and it followed him through the corridors of Casterly Rock as faithfully as his own shadow. And yet, there is something extraordinary that happened alongside all of this damage, something that the story does not always pause long enough to acknowledge. Tyrion found his brother. Jaime, 7 years his elder, golden and easy in the world in every way that Tyrion was not, chose differently. Jaime looked at the strange, large-headed, odd-eyed baby, and felt something that resembled genuine affection from very early on, and that affection never entirely departed. It was not without its complications. Jaime was a man shaped by his own considerable limitations, his own particular blindnesses, his own complicity in the family's patterns. But it was real. Tyrion grew up inside a house that was mostly cold, and the one warm thing in it was the big brother who would crouch down to his level and speak to him without condescension, who would teach him to ride when no one else could be bothered, who remembered, perhaps, that he had lost a mother too. What Tyrion built from all of this, from the loss he was born into, from the blame that attached to him, from the cold house and the cold father and the sister who looked at him and saw the instrument of her grief, was not remarkably a person defined by bitterness. He was not without bitterness. There are passages in his story where the bitterness breaks through the wit and the intellectual performance and simply sits there, enormous and old and exhausted, like a stone that has been carried too long and set down for a moment without apology. But it did not become his primary orientation. Instead, he built humour. He built irony. He built a comprehensive understanding of human weakness and self-deception that came from having spent his entire life watching people perform their confidence while feeling with perfect clarity the anxiety underneath it. He became, out of necessity, an expert in the distance between what people said they were and what they actually were. This is the wound at the beginning. It does not need to be dramatized. It does not need to be made more than what it is. A woman died. A man was made from that death, and from the particular coal that followed it. The man grew, sideways and quietly, into something that the house could not have predicted from any of the ingredients it knew how to work with. And the wound, which had never healed, which Tyrion carried as fluently as he carried his own name, would surface at the worst possible moments, in the cells beneath the Red Keep, in the courtroom where the city called for his execution, in the long, silent hours on a boat crossing the narrow sea with nothing on the horizon but more horizon. And it would cost him, and it would also make him. These are not contradictions, they are the same thing, seen from different angles. Let the breath go. There is no grief here that belongs to you tonight, only the old story, and the distance between you and it, and the warm fact of being here, whole and resting in the quiet. The weight of Tyrion's beginning settles into the deep past where it belongs, and you settle into the present, where there is nothing complicated, nothing unresolved, only the soft sound of the night and the rest that is already reaching for you. There is something restful about a mind that works well, not the anxious, grinding, relentless quality of a mind that cannot stop producing. That is exhausting, as anyone who possesses such a mind will confirm, but the particular quality of a well-furnished intellect at rest, moving through a problem the way a hand moves through warm water, without strain, without resistance, the solution arriving not through force, but through a kind of natural current that the mind creates simply by being what it is. Let your own mind drift in that direction now. Let it slow and settle. There is nothing it needs to solve tonight. There is only the pleasant weight of another mind's history, pressing very gently against your own, as the night deepens around you, and the story continues its unhurried journey through the long record of a remarkable man. Tyrion Lannister read everything. This is not a small thing to say about a person in a world where literacy was a privilege distributed with profound inequality, where books were expensive and scarce and frequently kept under ecclesiastical lock and chain. Casterly Rock had a library. All great houses did, as a matter of prestige, and Tyrion moved into that library with the focused intensity of a man who had found a place where his peculiarities were not handicaps. The library did not care how tall he was. The books did not register his mismatched eyes, or make the small involuntary adjustment of expression that most people made when they first saw him and were not prepared. The books opened, and inside them was Westeros in its full, impossible depth. Histories, military treatises, accounts of campaigns and famines and shifting alliances, Maester's charts of the seasons and the migrations of peoples, genealogies that stretched back into the Age of Heroes and dissolved into mythology before they found any solid ground. He did not read as a student performs reading, checking boxes of completed texts. He read the way a builder reads a landscape, looking for load-bearing elements, looking for the places where things would fail under pressure, looking for the lines of force that were not visible on the surface, but that explained everything about the way the surface was arranged. He read histories of the free cities and understood through accumulation why Braavos operated on principles so fundamentally different from the other Associ powers. He read accounts of the Dance of the Dragons and grasped, with the specific understanding of someone who had grown up watching siblings perform their rivalry in a household where the stakes were high, that the war had not been primarily about succession. It had been about two people who loved each other and could not find a way to stop wanting what the other one had. He read the accounts of the Blackfire rebellions and saw, beneath the martial romance of the narrative, a story about the seductive danger of charisma untethered from institution, which would turn out to be useful much later in ways he could not have anticipated at the time. The drinking accompanied the reading from an early age, and this too is worth understanding with some care, because it is easy to reduce Tyrion's relationship with wine to a coping mechanism or a character flaw, and thereby miss what it actually was, which was more complicated and more interesting. He drank because he enjoyed drinking. He drank because the blur of wine softened the specific frequency of social humiliation that he experienced constantly, the way a good coat softens the wind, not eliminating it, but making it bearable, making it possible to move through without the full brunt of it landing on exposed skin. He drank because it gave him an excuse for certain kinds of honesty that would have been too dangerous sober. You can say truths when you are drunk that would be considered intolerable, coming from a sober man, because the drunk man can be dismissed as simply a drunk man, which is a form of armour in itself. But he never, and this is the crucial thing, drank so much that the machinery stopped working. The mind remained operational underneath the wine in a way that astonished people who underestimated him, which was most people, most of the time. He could perform the precise calibration of appearing more impaired than he was, could let the performance of the foolish drunken dwarf run in the foreground, while the actual assessment of a room, a person, a political situation ran quietly in the background, processing the available data and producing conclusions that he would act on later, soberly, as if the conclusions had arrived by some other route. It was, in this sense, a form of the same basic technique he used everywhere. The performance of something reduced and contemptible in the front, the actual work happening elsewhere, unseen, in the margins where important men were not looking. There was a conversation, early in his tenure as Hand of the King, that reveals this quality with particular clarity. Pycelle, the Grand Maester, had been a fixture of the small council for decades, a man who had served through multiple reigns with the dedicated flexibility of someone whose primary loyalty was to his own survival. He was also, beneath the performance of ancient infirmity that he had cultivated to remarkable effect, considerably more capable than he appeared. Tyrion saw through this performance immediately, not because he had been briefed on it, not because a spy had told him, but because he recognized it. It was his own technique, deployed by someone who had arrived at it from a very different set of circumstances, but had produced essentially the same solution. He recognized the mechanism because he had built one himself. The books that shaped him most were not, perhaps, the ones that would have been predicted by his later political career. He read the military histories and they gave him the framework he would eventually use at the Blackwater, yes. He read the political chronicles and they gave him the background he would need as Hand. But the books that made the most visible mark on the specific texture of his intelligence were the books of natural philosophy, the accounts of the Meisters who had spent their lives studying the patterns of the world rather than the actions of its rulers. The study of tides and weather and the behaviour of animals in different environments, the long records of seasonal change and the observations about what conditions produced what outcomes in the natural world. These books gave him a way of thinking about systems, about the interaction of forces over time, that was less available in the political histories, which tended to organise events around the decisions of individual powerful people and thereby underestimated the degree to which those decisions were themselves determined by conditions the decision-makers had not chosen and did not control. He understood, from this reading, that most people most of the time were not exercising free will in any meaningful sense, but were responding to the pressure of their circumstances in ways that were largely predictable, if you understood the pressure well enough. This was not a cynical conclusion, or at least it did not have to be. It could equally be read as a compassionate one, as an understanding that the people who had hurt him, or failed him, or dismissed him, were doing so not primarily because of any quality of malice, but because of the forces operating on them, forces that they were no more fully conscious of than the tide is conscious of the moon that pulls it. He extended something resembling mercy, on this basis, to people who had not earned it by conventional accounting. Not unlimited mercy, not the self-destructive mercy of his grandfather Titos, but the considered provisional mercy of a man who understood causation well enough to be somewhat hesitant about assigning blame. His memory was extraordinary, not the rote memory of a man who has drilled facts into himself through repetition, though he had done plenty of that, but the living memory of a mind that had organised its acquisitions well, that had filed things in relation to each other rather than in sequence, so that retrieving one item of knowledge automatically activated the adjacent items, producing the connections that lesser minds made only deliberately and effortfully. He could recall the genealogy of a minor house from 40 years before the main story, and connect it in real time to a current political problem in a way that surprised even the people who were accustomed to being surprised by him. This was the memory of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time without anyone expecting him to, which meant the attention had been comprehensive and had included things that other people's attention had skipped. This pattern of recognition repeated itself throughout his time in power. Varys, the Master of Whisperers, operated in a perpetual fog of performed identity, the eunuch, the gossip, the man who had traded away his dignity for access. Tyrion saw the intelligence underneath it immediately and found it easier to work with Varys than any other member of the council, because they were both, in their own ways, men who had turned marginality into method. Littlefinger, by contrast, was a man whose cleverness Tyrion recognised and distrusted, because Littlefinger's intelligence operated without any loyalty beyond itself, and a mind without anchor is a dangerous thing to be near regardless of how impressive it is. Tyrion was impressed by Littlefinger and frightened of him in roughly equal measure, which is exactly the correct response. His understanding of military strategy was theoretical until the Blackwater, and then it became something else, something practical and costly and deeply personal. But even before that battle, his reading had given him a working comprehension of campaign logistics that most men born to command never developed, because they learned war through the body, through riding and fighting and the adrenaline of engagement, and never sat down long enough to understand the relationship between supply lines and outcomes, between the psychology of a besieged population and the decisions available to its defenders. Tyrion understood these things at a remove, which meant he understood them more clearly, without the distortion that experience sometimes produces when it becomes too vivid to think about clearly. He also understood people. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing, the most difficult to account for given the circumstances of his upbringing. He had every reason to develop a cynicism so comprehensive that it would have prevented genuine engagement with any individual human being, and the cynicism was certainly there. It surfaces regularly in the dry, blade-edged quality of his humour, in the way he could dismantle a pompous man's pretensions in 3 sentences and leave the wreckage smoking without apparent effort. But underneath the cynicism was something more complicated and more tender, a genuine curiosity about human beings and their particular arrangements of strength and weakness, and desire and fear. He liked people, not in the simple, easy way of a person with no complicated experiences of people, but in the real, tested, provisional way of someone who had found, over and over again, that even the people who had failed him, or hurt him, or underestimated him, were doing so for reasons that made a kind of sense once you understood the pressures operating on them. This is the architecture of an exceptional mind, not the architecture of a genius in the simple, romantic sense, the solitary, burning intelligence working in isolation, indifferent to the human world around it. The architecture of a mind shaped by exclusion, by the need to understand from outside what it could not access from inside, a mind that had turned its disadvantages into a kind of advanced equipment for perceiving things that the advantage could not see. It was, in the deepest sense, the Lannister gift, the cleverness of Lan the Clever, finally appearing in a vessel that the family could not recognise it in, and so could not use it, and so left it to develop in the wild, in the margins, in the library, in the drinking halls, and the long, quiet hours of a life that everyone assumed was being wasted. Let that land where it will. Let your breath slow, and let the mind you carry through the day, with all its efforts and its worries and its relentless to-do lists, simply rest for a moment beside the mind of a man who found a way to live inside his own particular intelligence without being destroyed by it. That is no small thing. The night is full and quiet. Drift. The next part of the story will find you in the deep hours when you are ready for it. If the story's keeping you company on the edge of sleep, please consider subscribing so that the next story waits for you when you return. And now back to the quiet, back to the dark, back to Tyrion, and the wars that were coming for him whether he was ready or not. Close your eyes now if they are not already closed. Let the darkness behind them be the darkness of a harbour at night, the black water moving slowly, the smell of salt and tar and the particular damp cold that comes off large bodies of water when the temperature drops and the wind finds no obstruction. It is a peaceful image, or it should be, except that in the harbour tonight there is something burning, and the reflection of what is burning makes the water look like copper, like old blood, like the inside of a furnace seen through a keyhole. This is the Battle of the Blackwater, and we are going to approach it slowly, quietly, from the direction of what it cost and what it meant, rather than from the direction of its drama, because the drama is well known and the meaning is what concerns us now. Let your breathing stay, slow. The fire in this imagined harbour is far away, and it cannot reach you here. Stannis Baratheon had a righteous cause. This is important to establish at the outset because the story is sometimes told as a simple narrative of the legitimate king defending his city against a usurper, and the question of which of those roles belongs to which man is significantly more complicated than that framing suggests. Stannis believed himself to be the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, and by the laws of succession as they were generally understood, he had a case. He was the older of Robert's surviving brothers. He was a man of extraordinary personal discipline and integrity. No one who knew him ever accused him of corruption or self-indulgence, which made him remarkable among the claimants of that terrible war. He was also, and this mattered enormously, in possession of an enormous fleet and an army that vastly outnumbered the defenders of King's Landing. The city was not ready. This is the context into which Tyrion Lannister stepped when he arrived to serve as Hand of the King, dispatched by Tywin, who wanted a competent person, managing the chaos in the capital, while he conducted his own campaigns in the field. The court was in disarray. Joffrey was a performance of kingship without the substance. All the cruelty of the Lannister reputation combined with none of the discipline or intelligence that had made that reputation survivable for the people immediately adjacent to it. Cersei was managing the city with a kind of frantic, improvisatory energy that could produce brilliant individual solutions while missing the systemic problems that individual solutions could not address. The city's food stores were being depleted, the city watch was corrupt and unreliable. The small council was composed of men whose primary interest was their own survival, which made them useful only in exact proportion to how clearly their survival aligned with the city's survival, which was not always the case. Tyrion spent his months as Hand doing what he had been doing all his life in private, reading the situation from the margins, identifying the load-bearing elements, making changes that were not visible until they were needed. He secured the grain. He rebuilt relationships with Shay that were complicated and tender, and ultimately doomed in ways neither of them could have foreseen. He identified the key vulnerabilities in the city's defences and addressed them with the resources available, which were fewer than he needed and more than most people would have found. He built coalitions, not the glamorous martial coalitions of men pledging swords, but the practical, unglamorous coalitions of bureaucrats and suppliers and city functionaries without whom no siege defence could be maintained. And then he invented the wildfire plan, or rather, he retrieved it from the category of dangerous, half-implemented ideas that Cersei had been developing with the pyromancers and shaped it into something operationally viable. Wildfire was the great secret of the Alchemist's Guild, a substance produced by processes that were half chemistry and half mysticism, a substance that burned on water, that could not be extinguished by conventional means, that spread where it was not intended to spread and destroyed what it was not intended to destroy with magnificent indifference. It was a weapon of last resort in the most literal sense. Last resort meaning that if you deployed it, and things went wrong, there was no subsequent resort available. You burned what was in the harbour, or the harbour burned you, and the city along with it. The preparations for the defence of King's Landing required Tyrion to become, for several months, the kind of person he had previously existed as a theory. He had read about the administration of sieges. He understood, abstractly, the relationship between resource management and defensive endurance, between the maintenance of civil order and the practical capacity to mount a military defence, between the morale of a garrison and the duration for which a garrison could be expected to hold. Now he had to enact this understanding in the actual city, with its actual population, its actual corrupt institutions, its actual shortage of time and material and reliable people. The gap between theoretical understanding and practical execution is always larger than theory suggests it will be, because theory operates in conditions of complete information, and practice operates in conditions of irreducible uncertainty and the specific, grinding, unpredictable friction of real things interacting with each other in real time. Tyrion crossed this gap through a combination of quick adjustment and the willingness to admit privately when his initial approach was not working and a different approach was needed. The wildfire itself deserves more attention than the dramatic narrative of the battle typically gives it, because the decision to deploy it was not simply the decision to use a dangerous weapon. It was a decision about acceptable risk, about the proportionality of the danger posed by the weapon against the danger posed by the fleet approaching the harbour. about whether the chance of the city burning in an uncontrolled wildfire conflagration was an acceptable risk, relative to the certainty of what Stannis' forces would do to the city and its population if they took it. Tyrion made this calculation with the full awareness that wildfire was not a precise instrument, that it would kill people on his own side as well as the enemy's, that the burning ships would shed burning debris across a wide area, that the chaos of fire and water and the collision of fleets in a confined harbour was going to produce outcomes that no one could fully predict. He made the calculation anyway, and the calculation was correct, and the correct calculation still had costs that he could see clearly, and that he did not flinch from seeing clearly, which was one of the ways he was different from the commanders who had less understanding of what they were doing. The scar that resulted from the fighting on the northern shore became, in the subsequent years, the most visible thing about him to people meeting him for the first time, more visible even than the dwarf's proportions, because the scar was the kind of wound that told a story. It bisected his face in a way that made the underlying structure of his skull more legible, gave him a quality of revealed interior that unsettled people who had been prepared for the dwarf's outsider quality, and found, instead, the quality of a man who had been broken open and reassembled without attempting to conceal the reassembly. He did not speak of it. He did not minimize it or dramatize it. He simply wore it, as he wore everything, with the practiced equanimity of a man who had long since been relieved of the possibility of presenting an unmarked face to the world, and had made peace, more or less, with the particular face that remained. It is worth sitting with the decision itself for a moment. The decision to fill the harbour with liquid fire, to gamble the city and everyone in it on the successful deployment of an uncontrollable substance against a fleet that was, by any conventional military assessment, superior to anything the defenders could put in the water. It was the kind of decision that a man makes when he has thought through every other option and found them all inadequate and simply arrived, with remarkable calm, at the conclusion that the unconventional thing is the only thing remaining. Tyrion made it. He made it, and then he went further, personally commanding the chain that would block the harbour, personally leading the sortie that held the northern shore long enough for the wildfire to achieve its purpose, personally doing the thing that a lord in his position was not expected to do, which was fight. He fought, and the battle was won. The chain held. The wildfire did what wildfire does when it is properly deployed, and the fleet that was bearing down on the city was destroyed in a spectacle of burning that people who survived it would spend the rest of their lives not quite being able to describe adequately. The Blackwater was a Lannister victory. It was, in the event, almost entirely Tyrion Lannister's victory, designed and executed under his authority, following his plan at personal risk that he undertook voluntarily. He took a lance to the face during the fighting on the northern shore, a wound that opened his face from below his left eye to the corner of his mouth, a wound that healed into a scar that he would carry for the rest of his life, the most visible evidence on his body of the most important thing he ever did for the family that could not see him. And then Tywin arrived. Tywin arrived at the climax of the battle, in the final hour, with the Tyrell forces that had been negotiated in circumstances that owed nothing to anything Tywin had done personally. He arrived on horseback through the gates of the city at the moment when the battle was won, and the city cheered him, and the histories recorded the victory as his and Tyrion, wounded, scarred, already being moved out of his chambers in the Tower of the Hand by the servants that his father had dispatched ahead of him, received a visit from his father that lasted perhaps 5 minutes and consisted entirely of logistics. There was no acknowledgement. There was no thank you. There was the smooth, mechanical transferal of authority from the placeholder to the principal, and Tyrion was once again in the position he had always occupied, which was outside the room where the credit was being distributed. Joffrey gave the honours to Tywin in front of the court. The court accepted this. The city accepted this. The histories that would be written in the years following accepted this. The man who had conceived and executed and personally risked his life for the defence of King's Landing received no public recognition from any quarter, and the man who had arrived at the conclusion of a battle he had not designed received a lord's parade and the gratitude of a kingdom. This is not an unusual story in the history of power. The people who do the work and the people who receive the credit are frequently not the same people, and the people who do the work frequently understand this before they begin, which is one of the more melancholy facts about the nature of organisations and institutions and families. but for Tyrion, it was something more than a professional injustice. It was the latest and most definitive confirmation of the pattern that his life had been enacting for 30 years. He could do the most important thing anyone did in the kingdom in a generation, and it would not change his father's assessment of him. The assessment had been made on the night of his birth, and it had been maintained with the same rigid discipline that Tywin maintained everything, and evidence to the contrary did not update it because the assessment was not based on evidence. It was based on grief and loss, and a wound that Tywin would never acknowledge, which meant it would never heal, which meant the assessment would stand until one of them died. Let the harbour grow dark again. Let the fire on the water sink and cool. The battle is over, and the dawn comes up over a city that does not know what it owes or to whom. Your breathing is slow and even. The water is quiet now. The last of the burning fleet has gone under the surface, and the harbour reflects a lightening sky. And somewhere in the city a man with a newly scarred face and no chambers to return to lies in a bed that is not his, and stares at a ceiling that is not familiar and understands, with the comprehensive, devastating clarity that is one of the gifts of his particular kind of mind, exactly what has happened and exactly what it means. There is a particular quality to the hour before a verdict is delivered, a suspension of the ordinary movement of time, a holding of breath that does not feel voluntary, as if the world itself is pausing to see which way the story will fall before it commits to the next moment. You've probably felt something like it. The waiting room before important news, the seconds between the question and the answer, the strange compressed stillness of a moment that is about to become past. Let your breathing move against that feeling now, slowly, steadily, because the verdict we are approaching tonight is one of the most important in the history of Westeros, and it is not primarily important because of what it decided, but because of what it revealed. Breathe in, hold it very gently, let it go. Joffrey Baratheon was dead, poisoned at his own wedding feast, in front of his court and his mother and the entire assembled nobility of the Seven Kingdoms, in a moment of such spectacular public humiliation that the kingdom had not yet absorbed it when the blame was being assigned. Someone had killed the king. The kingdom needed that someone to be identifiable, preferably someone whose guilt could be established without requiring too deep an investigation into the actual mechanics of what had happened, and in the political geography of the moment, the available candidates were limited. Tyrion was in the room. Tyrion had been seen in proximity to the wine. Tyrion had expressed, publicly and on multiple occasions, opinions about his nephew that were not compatible with the image of a loving uncle whose only wish was for the boy to flourish. Cersei wanted him dead. This was not new. The emotional logic of Cersei's relationship with Tyrion had always contained underneath everything else the original wound, the mother she had never fully remembered, taken by the brother she had never been able to forgive for surviving. Over the years this had become overlaid with additional grievances, some reasonable and some not, and by the time of the trial it had reached a kind of critical mass that was no longer entirely about anything as specific as a grievance, and was simply about the accumulated weight of 40 years of a feeling that did not have a good name. She wanted him gone. She had the resources to achieve this. The trial was the method. Tywin Lannister, who genuinely did not believe his son had killed the king, or if he suspected had concluded that the evidence was too thin to sustain a conviction through a fair proceeding, allowed the proceeding anyway. This is perhaps the most revealing thing Tywin did in the entire sequence of events, more revealing even than what came later. He allowed a trial whose verdict he did not believe was deserved, because the alternative, protecting his son from the political momentum that had built up around his guilt, would have cost him politically in ways he found unacceptable. He made a cold calculation. He sacrificed the just outcome for the politically manageable one, with the intention, apparently, of engineering a verdict that would send Tyrion not to execution but to the wall, which was the traditional repository for men whom the system needed to remove without destroying. The plan required Tyrion to play the role of the contrite, humbled, guilty-adjacent man asking for mercy. It required Tyrion to perform the familiar diminishment, to shrink himself into the version of himself that the room needed to see in order to feel safe. It was a deal. Tywin would control the proceedings, manage the witnesses, ensure the outcome did not include a death sentence. Tyrion would cooperate by being cooperative. It was, in its particular combination of cynicism and pragmatism, a very Lannister arrangement. And Tyrion agreed to it, provisionally, and then Shae walked into the courtroom. Shae was a woman he had loved in the specific, difficult, provisional, complicated way that people whose hearts have been damaged by early experiences tend to love. Not simply, not without reservation, but with a depth that was real for all its complications. She had been his companion and his confidant through his time as Hand, and he had been at genuine pains to protect her from the violence of court politics, sending her away before the city could use her against him. She had come back, she was in the courtroom, and she was testifying against him, saying things that were false, saying things that were distorted beyond recognition, performing a script that someone else had written for her, with the particular quality of a person who has made their peace with the choice and is simply delivering the lines. The witnesses the prosecution assembled were a study in the specific art of testimony that is technically accurate and fundamentally dishonest. The art of saying things that can be verified while allowing the structure of the presentation to imply things that cannot. Lords who had been present at various conversations testified to words that Tyrion had spoken, and the words were real, and the context that would have made them comprehensible had been carefully surgically removed, so that what remained was a series of statements that could mean one thing in context and only one thing out of it. It was effective. It was the kind of effectiveness that depended on the audience wanting a particular verdict and being satisfied by evidence that pointed in that direction, without actually proving it, which described most of the assembled court perfectly. They needed someone to have done this thing. Tyrion was available and had been designated, and the testimony was adequate to sustain the designation. His father sat through the proceedings with the particular stillness of a man who was managing multiple things simultaneously, managing the performance of the grave and impartial judge, managing his actual assessment of the proceedings, managing the political calculation about what outcome would best serve the family's interest in the medium term, and managing, buried deepest of all, whatever the man he had been before he became entirely the institution he served, felt about watching his younger son subjected to this process. There is no way to know what proportion of Tywin's stillness was discipline, and what proportion was something closer to genuine numbness, a point beyond which the emotional system had simply ceased to generate responses because the responses had nowhere to go. The face gave nothing. The accounts of people who watched him during the trial describe a man who appeared to be made of the same stone as the hall around him, and perhaps by that point in his life he substantially was. The people in the gallery were perhaps the most revealing element of the entire proceeding. They had come expecting a spectacle, and the proceedings had provided one. The spectacle of a Lannister being tried for the murder of a Baratheon king by a court controlled by Lannisters, which contained its own particular irony that the gallery was sophisticated enough to appreciate, even if it was not sophisticated enough to say aloud. Some of them had been in the city during the siege. Some of them had been on the streets in the desperate final hours before the Tyrell and Lannister forces arrived at the gate. None of them had been told, formally or informally, what role the dwarf at the table had played in the events that preceded their survival. The hand of the king had been badly wounded and had spent the crucial hours of the victory's celebration absent, replaced by his father with a speed that precluded any period of public acknowledgement, and so the gallery watched the trial of a man whose most significant act they had not been given the context to understand. He had hoped, in the days between the arrest and the trial, that Jaime would find a way to stop it. Not to spring him from the cell. He understood that was impossible, that the political machinery had reached a momentum that individual intervention could not reverse, but to find some face-saving arrangement, some quiet negotiation in a back corridor that would produce a different outcome through a different channel, the way Lannister business had always been managed at its most important junctures, not in the public spectacle, but in the private room where the people who actually held power could speak plainly to each other. Jaime tried. The price Tywin set for Jaime's help was Jaime's return to Casterly Rock as heir and lord, the surrender of his position in the Kingsguard, the resumption of the dynastic function that Jaime had avoided for 15 years. Jaime accepted. Tyrion was not told that this price had been paid on his behalf, which turned out to matter enormously to how the subsequent events unfolded. Something changed in Tyrion Lannister when Shae finished speaking. It is difficult to say exactly what changed or when it happened, or whether it was specifically Shae's testimony that caused it, or whether Shae's testimony was simply the last weight placed on something that had been under load for a very long time, but something changed, and what changed was the willingness to continue performing the required diminishment. He had been performing it for 34 years. He had been shrinking himself into the acceptable container of the family's tolerance his entire life, compressing his actual quality into whatever shape the current situation demanded, playing the fool, or the drunk, or the harmless curiosity, or the useful minor functionary, depending on which performance was most likely to allow him to survive the current room. He was done. He stood up and spoke. He looked at the room, at the judges on their seats, at the witnesses, at his father's face at the top of the assembly, and he demanded a trial by combat, and before he demanded it, he said the thing he had never permitted himself to say in 34 years of considerable provocation. He told the room what he thought of it, not with the usual dry, blade-edged wit, not with the ironic deflection that allowed him to be honest, without being fully accountable for his honesty. He told the room directly, plainly, with something that read as rage and was partly rage, and was also something more complicated than rage, a kind of grief, stripped of its disguises, finally speaking in its own voice. He told them he was innocent. He told them that it did not matter, that he had been put on trial for being a dwarf, that this was the crime for which he had been on trial his entire life, that he was done with their justice and wished them all to hell, or words to that effect, delivered with the particular force of a man who has stopped caring about the consequences of honesty and finds the stopping caring to be enormously clarifying. The court was shocked. Courts are generally shocked when the proceedings stop following the agreed script. Tywin's face, by the accounts that survived, did not visibly change, which was itself a kind of information. It is worth sitting with what Tyrion said and what it cost him to say it, because there is a version of that speech that looks like a catastrophic loss of strategic control, a man destroying his own best chance of survival by indulging his emotions in a moment when survival required performance. And there is another version, equally valid, that looks like the only honest thing he had ever been allowed to do in public, the first moment in his life when he spoke from the full volume of his actual experience rather than the carefully managed reduction of it that every room he had ever entered had required. Both versions are true. The moment was simultaneously a tactical disaster and something that looked, from the inside, like freedom. The trial ended. The trial by combat was granted. Its result, Oberyn Martell's unexpected and devastating death at the hands of the Mountain, left Tyrion condemned, and Jaime and Varys found him a way out, and he escaped the city through a passage in the sewers, and on the way out he made a decision that would permanently end the question of his relationship with his father. But that is the story of the next rooms, the rooms in the Tower of the Hand at the top of the stairs. For now, what matters is the courtroom and what broke open in it. The 34 years of compressed experience finally finding its way to the surface and speaking, for once, without translation. Let the courtroom empty around you. Let the voices go quiet and the torches dim, and the great oppressive weight of the assembled nobility of Westeros dissolve back into imagination. Your own chest is clear. Your own voice, whenever you need it, is yours to use. The night is quiet and the old trial is long over, and what remains of it is simply this, the image of a man who decided at enormous cost to stop pretending. Rest in that thought. Let it expand a little. Let it be the last waking thing before the sleep takes you deeper. Let the dark deepen around you now. There is a particular quality to the middle hours of the night, the hours past midnight when the day's business has completely surrendered and whatever comes next has not yet begun to form, when the mind, if you allow it, simply floats, not empty, not anxious, just drifting. The way a leaf drifts in a current that is moving slowly and has no particular urgency about its destination. Find that quality now, if you can, and drift with it into the story of a man who spent approximately 8 months as the most powerful political operative in Westeros, and whose contribution to the survival of everyone around him went almost entirely unacknowledged by almost everyone he saved. Breathe, and let the story of the Hand's game begin. The title of Hand of the King was, by tradition, the most powerful administrative position in the Seven Kingdoms, second only to the throne itself, and in practice often considerably more powerful than the throne, since the throne was occupied by persons of variable capability, and the Hand was chosen theoretically for competence. The great hands of history, Jon Arryn, who had built the alliance that put Robert on the throne, Eddard Stark, who had tried and failed to maintain it through the sheer force of his moral seriousness, had been men of enormous personal authority, chosen because they commanded respect across the kingdom's factional landscape. Tyrion was chosen because Tywin wanted a competent person running the capital while he conducted his campaigns, and Tyrion was available, and sending him away from Casterly Rock solved two problems simultaneously. He arrived to find the city in a state that was, in the particular vocabulary of political analysis, bad. The small council was a collection of individuals whose shared interest in self-preservation did not translate into any shared interest in the kingdom's actual governance. Grand Maester Pycelle was a creature of accommodation, having survived multiple reigns by making himself useful to whoever was currently in power in ways that were difficult to pin down and impossible to sanction. Littlefinger controlled the crown's finances with the specific casualness of a man who understands that financial opacity is its own form of power, who had built a system so complicated and so dependent on his personal knowledge that removing him from it would be nearly as damaging as leaving him in it. Varys moved through the city like water moves through rock, leaving no obvious trace and achieving effects that were only apparent long after the cause had dissipated. Tyrion's first significant act was to identify which of these men was lying to him about what. He did this not through any dramatic confrontation, not through the deployment of threats or the revelation of discovered secrets, but through the simple expedient of telling each of them a different piece of false information, and then observing which piece reached Cersei's ears first. It is a technique as old as courts themselves, a test that is so old it has a name in several languages, and it tells you only one thing, and tells you that thing with perfect reliability: who the traitor is. Tyrion performed it casually, over a matter of days, in the margins of other conversations, and when the result came back it was Pycelle, and Pycelle was removed from the council and placed in a cell. Not because Tyrion needed him punished, but because the cell was a message, and the message was that the new hand was not performing the incompetence that his father had perhaps led them to expect. He replaced Pycelle with nothing for the time being. The gap on the council was itself a message, that the hand was not scrambling to fill positions, which would have suggested anxiety, but was comfortable leaving a space empty while he considered his options, which suggested the opposite. He managed the relationship with Cersei with a precision that was remarkable, given how much Cersei hated him, and how little she was inclined to disguise it. He could not neutralize her opposition, but he could work around it, routing his decisions through channels she did not control, completing things before she became aware they were in progress, leaving her with accomplished facts that were more expensive to reverse than to accept. It was governance through the management of information flow, and it required the same skills he had spent his childhood developing: the ability to operate unnoticed in the margins, to complete work in the spaces between other people's attention. The Guild of Alchemists occupied a peculiar position in the infrastructure of the city, and Tyrion's engagement with them during his tenure as Hand was one of the more genuinely unusual aspects of his administration. The alchemists were practitioners of a craft that straddled the boundary between the reliably reproducible and the genuinely mysterious. They produced wildfire consistently, and they produced other substances that behaved in ways that the natural philosophy texts did not quite account for, and they maintained, around both the products and the processes, an opacity that was partly professional secrecy and partly the carefully cultivated mystique of people whose social survival depended on not being fully understood. Tyrion spent time with them. Not the ceremonial, inspectorial time that a lord might spend reviewing the resources available to him, but actual time sitting in the workshop spaces that smelled of sulphur and something else that had no name, asking questions that the practitioners were not accustomed to being asked by people above them in the social hierarchy. The question of what it meant to govern a city was one he returned to repeatedly during those months, in the private hours when the public work was done and the mind was still running but without a specific target, turning over the day's problems and what they revealed about the deeper structure of the thing he was managing. Cities were not kingdoms, and the techniques that worked at the level of kingdoms, the management of great lords through the strategic application of fear and favour, the maintenance of alliances through marriage and the calculated distribution of titles and lands, did not translate easily to the level of the city, which operated on different dynamics, motivated by different concerns, vulnerable to different kinds of breakdown, A lord defied you because he calculated that the benefits of defiance outweighed the costs. A population defied you because it was hungry and desperate and had nothing left to lose, and a population in that condition was a different kind of problem entirely, one that fear could not manage, and favour could not manage, and that required, instead, something more fundamental, the actual provision of the thing they needed, or at minimum a credible promise of it. He found himself thinking during these months about his father's methods and their limits. Tywin's genius was at the level of the great game, the management of houses and armies and political alliances across the full width of the continent. At that level, the methods worked brilliantly and had worked for 40 years. But the city was not the great game. The city was something smaller and closer, and in some ways more complicated, because it was a collection of individual people rather than a collection of institutional interests. And individual people did not respond to the management of institutional interests in a reliable way. They noticed things that institutions did not notice. They responded to things that institutions did not track. The mother in the market district cared whether her children ate, not whether the Lannister position in the succession was secure. The stevedore on the river docks cared whether he was paid, not whether the realm's financial architecture would survive the ongoing wars. Tyrion governed them, or tried to, with the attention to their actual concerns that his father would not have thought was his job, and whether it made a measurable difference to the city's capacity to survive the coming siege was impossible to say with certainty, but it was the kind of thing that he was inclined to believe mattered. The Tyrells were his most significant diplomatic achievement during the period of the Handship, and it is characteristic of his method that the achievement is frequently attributed to other factors. His negotiation of the alliance between the Lannisters and House Tyrell, an alliance that would ultimately save the city and continue to shape the political landscape for years afterward, was conducted through an understanding of Margaery Tyrell's political position that he arrived at by reading the situation rather than being briefed on it. He understood that the Tyrells needed legitimacy more than they needed the material resources they were offering. They were the most powerful family in the Reach, and they had backed a losing claimant, and they needed to convert their material power into political security, and the only currency that bought political security in Westeros was proximity to the throne. He could offer that. He offered it. The alliance held. He is perhaps most underappreciated in his management of the city's food supply during the siege. This is unglamorous work. It does not generate the kinds of stories that circulate at feasts or get inscribed in the formal histories that maesters maintain. But cities do not survive sieges on courage or on the inspirational quality of their ruling family's rhetoric. They survive on food and water and the maintenance of the social order that allows both to be distributed without catastrophic breakdown. Tyrion secured grain stores. He managed the relationship with the city's merchant class with a specific combination of coercion and incentive that kept goods flowing without driving the merchants out of the city or underground. He maintained, through the most desperate weeks of the approaching siege, a distribution system that prevented the kind of starvation-driven social breakdown that had destroyed defended cities in other wars. None of this was visible to the population it served. Invisibility was, by now, his natural habitat. He had spent his entire life perfecting the technique of being somewhere without being seen to be somewhere, of affecting outcomes without appearing to affect them, of working in the space between other people's categories, in the gap between the fool and the threat where no one was quite sure what they were looking at, and therefore did not look too carefully. As Hand, he deployed this invisibility as policy, not because he was hiding, but because the work required it. A Hand who made himself conspicuous attracted opposition before the work was complete. A Hand who remained low made progress before anyone realized progress was being made. It is worth pausing here to notice what we are actually describing. We are describing the most effective governance that the Iron Throne received in the entire period of the War of the Five Kings, produced by a man whom the official record treated as a useful embarrassment, by a method that the official record did not know how to categorize, in service of a family that was actively trying to manage him rather than deploy him. The effectiveness was real. The records simply do not reflect it, because the records were written by people who had decided in advance what Tyrion was, and what he was did not include being the most capable administrator the city had seen in a generation. This is the Hand's game. Not the dramatic version, not the version with the poisoned wine and the whispered threats, and the dramatic council chamber confrontations that the stories prefer. The real version, which is less photogenic and more interesting. the version where an extraordinarily capable mind works systematically through a list of problems that would have overwhelmed a lesser intelligence, producing solutions that were elegant precisely because they were invisible, saving a city that would not remember it was saved and could not be told by whom. The game was played. The game was won. The player walked off the field without a trophy, without acknowledgement, with a scar on his face and a room that was no longer his, as usual, as always. The night wraps around all of this now, around the council chamber and the grain stores and the negotiations and the small intelligence test that confirmed a traitor on the first week. Let it all grow distant and quiet. You are breathing slowly. The city in this story sleeps occasionally, in the gaps between its emergencies. You can sleep more completely than it ever could, because your emergencies are resolved, your watch is not required tonight. Let the hand's game fade into the middle distance. The next segment waits further down the dark water, patient as the tide, and if this story is keeping you company on the edge of sleep, please subscribe so the next one is waiting when you return. Sleep now, drift. There is something about a sea crossing that changes a person. Not always, not in any reliable, documentable way that a maester could chart and categorize and file with confidence. But there is something in the particular experience of leaving a shore behind, in the visual moment when the land that contained your entire previous life shrinks to a line and then to a shadow, and then to nothing, when there is only water in every direction and you are genuinely, physically, between one version of your life and whatever comes next, that allows the person crossing to understand, perhaps for the first time, that they are not fixed, that the categories they have been living inside were geographical as much as they were essential, that the story that has been telling itself about them for decades has a territorial limit. Let the water come around you now, dark and vast and peacefully indifferent. Let the shore you know grow small. Breathe. And drift with Tyrion Lannister across the narrow sea. He left Westeros in the hold of a ship, hidden in a crate that smelled of sawdust and the particular stale air of an enclosed space that has been sealed for too long. Varys had arranged it, with his characteristic efficiency and his characteristic opacity about what he expected to receive in return. Tyrion had blood on his hands. His father's blood, which we will come to in a moment, and Shay's blood, which is the harder thing to carry, and the thing that followed him across the water more persistently than any official warrant could have. He was a fugitive from a city that had tried to execute him for a murder he had not committed, and on his way out of the city he had committed 2 murders, one of which was arguably justified by any reasonable moral accounting, and one of which was not, and which he knew was not, and which he could not think about yet because the boat was still moving, and there was still nothing to do but sit with what he had done in the dark hold of a rocking ship, and wait for another country. Pentos was where he arrived. Not the Pentos of commerce and cosmopolitan energy that the city presents to the world in its better hours, but the private Pentos of Illyrio Mopatis' manse, a world of cushioned excess and elaborately prepared food, and the kind of comfort that is extended to people whose utility is currently uncertain but might become significant. Illyrio was a man Tyrion could read with speed and accuracy, a man of considerable intelligence who had arranged his intelligence inside a performance of jovial, almost childlike enthusiasm that distracted people from taking the intelligence seriously, which was, Tyrion noted, a technique he was personally familiar with from the opposite direction. They understood each other, provisionally, as people who have adopted complementary disguises sometimes understand each other, with a specific mixture of respect and wariness that comes from recognizing your own method in someone else's face. He drank heavily during this period. This is recorded by the people who were around him and who left accounts, with a mixture of concern and a kind of resigned acknowledgement that Tyrion's relationship with wine was not a recent development and was unlikely to be meaningfully addressed through conversation. He drank, and he thought, and he sat with the weight of what he had done and what had been done to him, and tried to find some configuration of those things that he could live inside going forward. The thinking was real and serious, even under the wine, and what it was working toward, slowly and without any particular destination in mind, was the question of whether there was anything left in the world worth caring about. He had cared about his family, and his family had used him and tried to kill him. He had cared about Shay, and Shay had been weaponized against him. He had cared about the city, and the city had cheered for his execution. The caring had not gone well on the whole, and the question of whether to continue with it was a genuine question. Daenerys Targaryen entered this equation as a destination before she entered it as a person. Varys had a plan, which he revealed to Tyrion in stages, with the characteristic precision of a man who understood that information released in the correct sequence is considerably more persuasive than information delivered all at once. The plan involved a queen across the narrow sea who had dragons, actual dragons, the first in a century and a half, which was either a miracle or a catastrophe depending entirely on whose side you were on, and who was attempting to build a coalition sufficient to reclaim a throne that the Lannister family had been occupying, at considerable cost to everyone for the past 18 years. Varys believed she was the right ruler for Westeros. Tyrion, who had spent more time than almost anyone thinking about what a right ruler for Westeros would look like and what qualities they would need to possess, was prepared to be convinced but not yet convinced. The Essozi world was nothing like what the books had prepared him for. This is not unusual. The world is never quite like what the books have prepared anyone for, because books are made of words and words are made of previous words, and the thing itself is made of matter and time and the specific irreducibility of actual experience. But the gap between his reading and his arrival was wider than he had expected, in specific ways that were instructive about the limits of knowledge acquired at a remove. The books described the political structures and the economies and the religious practices and the notable histories of the various cities and peoples, and they were accurate about these things in a general way, but they could not describe the smell of the air coming off the market in a Marish city at midday, or the specific quality of the light that came through coloured glass into a room in a Pentoshi manse, or the way that the heat in the interior of the Essos continent was different in its character from any heat he had previously encountered, drier and older somehow, as if the land itself remembered a time before there was rain. The dragons were young when he encountered them for the first time, young in the way that things with very long natural lifespans are young, which is to say not small, not gentle, not in any way amenable to the ordinary adjustments that people make in the presence of young and vulnerable creatures. They had the specific danger of things that were not fully formed, but already far beyond the scale at which formation was cute. He watched them from a distance that he was informed was not safe, because closer distances were even more obviously not safe, and from that distance they had a quality that he struggled to describe accurately in any subsequent account. Not the quality of animals exactly, which was what he had been expecting based on the best available accounts, but the quality of something that had its own perspective, its own ongoing assessment of the world it inhabited, its own complex and ongoing relationship with the human beings who moved around it, and who it did not need but had, for reasons of its own, decided to tolerate. He wrote about the journey, in the private record that survived the subsequent events imperfectly, as the period in his life when he finally understood what his father had never grasped. Tywin had built his life around the assumption that the world could be managed, that with sufficient intelligence and sufficient force and sufficient discipline, and sufficient willingness to do what needed to be done without sentimentality, the outcomes could be controlled and the family's position could be maintained and the arc of events could be bent, consistently, toward the family's continued advantage. The sea crossing had shown Tyrion the simple physical fact of a world that was larger than any family's management capacity, that extended in every direction past any horizon any person could reach, that contained things that did not care at all about the Lannister name, or the Lannister reputation, or the accumulated history of the Lannister political project. This was not a despairing discovery. It was, strangely, a relieving one, the relief of a person who's been carrying an impossible responsibility and has finally encountered the evidence that the responsibility was always impossible, that the failure to fully discharge it was inevitable, and that the attempt itself was therefore not the catastrophe it had seemed from the inside. The journey to find her was long and strange and frequently unpleasant. He acquired a companion in Jorah Mormont, a bear of a man with his own complicated exile, and his own unresolved relationship with the person he was travelling toward, and between them they had enough mutual dysfunction to supply several ordinary conversations with material, which they occasionally did when the wine and the road and the particular boredom of long travel created the conditions for honesty. Tyrion liked Jorah with the specific affection he tended to feel for people who had done something genuinely terrible and were carrying it honestly rather than constructing elaborate justifications. Jorah had betrayed the woman he would come to worship, and he knew it, and he did not pretend otherwise, and there was something in that honest carrying of guilt that Tyrion found more tolerable than the alternative. And then there were the dragons. He saw them before he met her, which was the correct order, because the dragons changed the calibration for everything that followed. They were not the dragons of the stories, not the domesticated war machines of the Targaryen conquest, bred and trained over generations into instruments of directed military force. These were younger, wilder, less managed, creatures that had grown up on a continent that did not entirely know what to do with them, and had therefore, in the absence of consistent handling, become something genuinely strange and magnificent and deeply dangerous. He stood near them once in a situation where the standing near them was not voluntary, and felt what everyone felt in the presence of something that large and that old in its nature, even if not in its years, the specific, clarifying quality of fear that arrives when the human animal encounters something that reminds it, physically and immediately, that it is not at the top of all available hierarchies. Meeting Daenerys was a meeting of minds eventually, after an initial period of mutual assessment that was complicated by the fact that she was the daughter of the king that Tyrion's family had replaced, and Tyrion was the son of the man most directly responsible for that replacement. She wanted to distrust him for reasons that were historically legitimate. He wanted to believe in her for reasons that were psychologically complicated. After a life of not finding anyone worth following, of being surrounded by people whose self-interest was more naked than their stated commitments, of watching the political world operate at a level of cynicism that he shared enough to understand completely, he'd arrived at the tentative conclusion that she might be the thing she appeared to be. A person who actually wanted what she said she wanted. A person whose ambition had a moral content, not merely a material one. The advice he gave her was the most honest advice he'd given anyone in a position of power. Not because he had become a different person across the water. He was still Tyrion, still ironic, still protected by the wit, still carrying everything he always carried. But because he was no longer operating within the family system, no longer modulating his intelligence to fit the container the family had assigned him, no longer performing the acceptable version of himself for an audience that had already decided what he was, he could think and speak at full volume for perhaps the first time in his adult life, and what he said, at full volume, was often uncomfortable and frequently right, and occasionally both simultaneously. She did not always listen. This is important to record. The story of Tyrion's service to Daenerys is not a story of the brilliant counsellor whose brilliant counsel was followed and vindicated. It is a more complicated story about the limits of good advice in the face of genuine personal trauma, about the specific difficulty of counselling someone whose formative experiences have produced a set of convictions that are both morally real and strategically dangerous, about what it costs to be the person who has to say the true thing to the person who most needs to hear it, and least wants to. He said the true things. She heard them, filtered them, sometimes acted on them, and sometimes did not, and the consequences of both accumulated in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. The narrow sea is wide, and the journey across it changes things, and then the things on the other side change them further, and the person who arrives on the new shore is not identical to the person who left the old one. Tyrion left Westeros as a fugitive with his father's blood on his hands, and arrived on the other side as something that did not have a clean name yet. Not quite a servant, not quite an advisor, not quite a free agent. Something that was trying to figure out what it was worth, and what it could still do, and what, after everything, was worth doing. Breathe deeply. The sea is quiet now. The crossing is done. The shore ahead is dim in the pre-dawn light. And there is still so much of the story remaining, and you have all night for it, and more. There is a peculiar kind of courage in making people laugh. Not the courage of the battlefield, not the courage of the public declaration, or the principled stand. Those kinds of courage are visible, are recognized as courage by the people who witness them, carry their own reward in the admiration they generate. The courage of the comedian is something different, something quieter, and in certain ways more demanding. It requires the willingness to offer yourself as the vehicle of release, to take the weight of the room's anxiety or discomfort or grief and convert it, through the specific alchemy of wit and timing, into something that allows people to breathe again. It requires the perpetual vulnerability of the attempt, and it requires the ability to do all of this without revealing that it cost anything, because the moment the cost is visible, the comedy dies. Let your breathing slow as we think about this together. Let the night settle around you like something kind. Tyrion Lannister was funny. This is not a simple thing to say about a person, and it is not said simply here. He was funny in the way that people who have been forced to develop their intelligence in a hostile environment are frequently funny, from the inside out, from genuine perception rather than performance, in a way that arrived unannounced and with such precision that the target of the observation rarely had time to arrange a defence before the comment had already found its mark. He made lords laugh who did not want to laugh at the dwarf's jokes. He made Cersei laugh, on at least one recorded occasion in his youth, before the relationship had calcified into its more familiar form of mutual armed neutrality. He made Tywin almost smile, which was, in the family's particular register of emotional expression, roughly equivalent to another man weeping. The wit served multiple functions, which is true of all serious wit. Wit that is only funny without any additional load is entertainment. Wit that also does something, that also accomplishes a social or political or emotional purpose alongside its primary function of generating laughter, is something more valuable and considerably rarer. Tyrion's wit was of this second, more complicated kind. It deflected. When someone made a remark about his height, he had the response ready before the words were fully formed, and the response was so perfectly calibrated to the moment that the person making the remark frequently found themselves uncertain, afterwards, whether they had scored a point or given one away. This is a technique that requires extraordinary presence of mind, the ability to be in the emotional position of the person targeted while simultaneously operating from outside it, assembling the most effective possible response from available material in the fraction of a second that the social moment allows. It also bought him time. A man who makes people laugh while they are in the process of deciding what to do about him creates, in the space of the laugh, a moment of uncertainty that can be enormously useful. The decision to harm someone, or humiliate someone, or dismiss someone requires a certain sustained focus, a willingness to commit to the downward assessment and see it through. A joke interrupts that focus. It introduces a moment of involuntary warmth, or at least of involuntary recognition, that complicates the pure contempt that violence or dismissal requires. Tyrion survived rooms he should not have survived, in part, by making the room laugh before the room could complete its worst calculations about him. It was armour, and he wore it continuously, and the wearing of it was exhausting in ways that he almost never acknowledged, because acknowledging the exhaustion would have been an admission that the armour was armour rather than simply his personality. The tragedy of the wit is where this becomes genuinely difficult to think about without sadness, because the same intelligence that generated the comedy also generated the most precise possible understanding of what the comedy was costing. Tyrion was not unaware that he was performing. He was perhaps more aware of it than anyone who has ever done it. The doubled consciousness of the person who is both inside the performance and watching the performance from outside, seeing both the room's response to the joke and the space that the joke is filling, the gap between what he is saying and what he is not allowed to say, the comedy that comes at exactly the point where the grief would be if the grief were permitted to speak. The people who made him laugh, who gave him the specific pleasure of encountering wit that matched his own rather than requiring him to slow down to be understood, were rare and precious to him. Bronn was one. The sellsword from uncertain origins with a sharp tongue and the complete absence of pretension about what he was and what he wanted was a person Tyrion could rest with, in the specific sense of not needing to manage the interaction, not needing to calibrate his intelligence to the level of the room, not needing to maintain the performance that most rooms required. Bronn said what he thought and wanted what he said he wanted, and found the gap between the stated values of the noble world and its actual operation as ridiculous as Tyrion did, and was comfortable saying so, which made the time they spent together feel, more than almost any other time in Tyrion's life, like genuine ease rather than managed relaxation. The things that made Tyrion Lannister laugh most reliably were not the things you might expect from a man with his political sophistication. He did not laugh most at the clever turns of phrase or the precise satirical observation, though he appreciated both. He laughed most at the gap between pretension and reality, specifically the gap as it manifested in people who were not self-aware enough to notice it in themselves. The great lord who had clearly rehearsed an impression of gravitas and was deploying it with the visible effort of a performance rather than the ease of an actual quality. This was, to Tyrion, reliably and profoundly funny, in a way that had never ceased to be so regardless of how many times he encountered it. The Emperor with no clothes had always been the funniest story in any tradition, not because the Emperor was stupid, but because the system that maintained the pretense was so comprehensive and so committed that it could not see what was obvious from outside it, and Tyrion had always been outside it, which gave him the view. His most famous observations, the ones that survived in the accounts of people who had known him and were subsequently retold in contexts ranging from academic histories to the quiet conversations of people who'd been in the same rooms as him, shared a structural quality that was worth understanding as the thing that made them survive rather than evaporate the way most witty remarks do. They were true. Not in the simple, verifiable sense of factual accuracy, but in the deeper sense of capturing something real about the way things worked, the way people were, the way power operated and love operated, and the world organized itself around the competing interests of all the creatures trying to live in it simultaneously. Wit that is only clever dies when the context that made it clever dies. Wit that is also true becomes a kind of portable wisdom, the kind of thing that people carry with them long after they have forgotten who said it or when or under what circumstances. There are moments in his story where the wit fails. They are worth attending to because they reveal what the wit was holding at a distance. In the dungeons beneath the Red Keep waiting for the trial by combat, the wit does not come. There is only the cell and the dark and the weight of what had happened in the room at the top of the stairs, and Tyrion sits with that weight without any of the usual equipment, without the wine and the books and the social context that would normally provide material for the intelligence to work on. The silence in those scenes, in the accounts that survive, is very loud. It is the loudness of a particular quality of loneliness, not the ordinary loneliness of a person who lacks company, but the deeper loneliness of a person whose primary survival technique has failed them and who is not quite sure what remains underneath it. He was, underneath everything, a person who wanted to be loved. This is perhaps the most important thing to say about Tyrion Lannister, and perhaps the thing most easily missed by readings of him that focus on the cleverness and the wit and the political capability. The intelligence was real, the wit was real, the political understanding was real. But underneath all of it, deeper than all of it, was a person who had arrived in the world at an enormous cost to everyone around him and had spent his entire subsequent life trying to find a configuration of his existence that would make that cost feel, to the people who had paid it, like it might have been worth something. He wanted his father to look at him and see something other than the catastrophe of his birth. He wanted his sister to understand that he had not chosen to survive. He wanted the city he saved to know it had been saved, and to know by whom. None of these things happened. The record on each of them is definitive. Tywin never gave him what he was looking for. Cersei never relinquished the story she had told about him. The city cheered for his execution. And Tyrion continued, which is the remarkable thing. He continued with his full complement of intelligence and wit and comprehension of human nature and political capability, not because he had found a way to not need what he had been denied, but because he had found a way to carry the need alongside everything else, to move forward with it rather than waiting for it to be resolved before he moved. This is the courage that does not look like courage, because it does not look like anything in particular. It looks like a man making a joke at a dinner table. It looks like a man ordering another cup of wine. It looks like ordinary motion through an ordinary evening, and what it actually is the continuous low-intensity achievement of a person who has decided to remain. The comedy and the tragedy are not opposites in Tyrion's case. They are not even in tension. They are, in the deeper sense, the same thing viewed from different distances. The comedy is what the tragedy looks like when it is moving, when it has found a way to keep going rather than stopping, when it has converted its weight into momentum, when it has taken the specific qualities of its pain and forged them into the specific qualities of its wit. The laugh that Tyrion generates in any given room is the same thing as the grief that he never gets to put down. It is the grief in motion. It is the grief with a punchline. There is something in the history of this man, in the long record of the wit and the damage and the persistence through both, that speaks to something universal, something that does not require the specific circumstances of a dwarf in a medieval fantasy continent to be recognizable. The experience of developing extraordinary capability precisely because you were excluded from ordinary access. The experience of making yourself indispensable in ways that are nonetheless never quite acknowledged. The experience of loving people who cannot fully receive the love. The experience of continuing. These are not exotic experiences. They are human experiences distributed across every social position and historical period, recognizable to anyone who has lived long enough to accumulate a significant quantity of things they were not expecting life to contain. Let the wit settle around you now like something comfortable and bittersweet. Let the laughter that Tyrion spent his life generating have a moment to simply exist without anyone needing to produce it. The night is deep, and the story is almost told, and what remains is the longest question, the one about legacy and love and what a man leaves behind when he finally stops running. That question waits in the next quiet passage of the dark. For now, simply breathe, and let the comedy and the tragedy rest together, as they always have been, inseparable and true. We are near the end now. Not the end of the story. The story continues past the point where any account can follow it with confidence, and we are not going to rush it toward a conclusion that the night does not require. But we are near the end of this particular telling, this particular approach to the man and his history, and so let us slow down rather than hurrying. Let the breath come long and easy. Let the body feel its full resting weight, not as something to be managed but as something to be received. You have been carrying yourself through a long day and a long story, and you do not need to carry anything now. Let it all go. And let us speak, in the final quiet of this telling, about what Tywin Lannister never understood, and what that failure to understand cost him, and what Tyrion, despite everything, managed to preserve. Tywin understood power. He understood it with a thoroughness and a sophistication that very few people in the history of Westeros matched. He understood that power was not primarily a matter of the sword, though the sword was indispensable, the necessary foundation without which all other structures would eventually collapse, but primarily a matter of the narrative that surrounded the sword. Who tells the story of the battle determines what the battle means. Who controls the interpretation of events controls in the deepest sense the events themselves, because events without interpretation are just weather. Things that happen, meaningless until someone assigns them meaning. Tywin was a master of meaning assignment. The Reigns of Castamere was not just a battle, it was a text, carefully authored, and Tywin had been its author, and it had been read correctly by every lord in the Seven Kingdoms for 40 years. What Tywin did not understand, what his formation had made it impossible for him to understand, was that the narrative required a human centre, not just a house, not just a reputation, not just a pattern of historically consistent behaviour that made the family's promises and threats equally credible, but a person that other people could attach to with something approaching genuine feeling, a person who generated not just the respect-adjacent fear that Tywin commanded, but something more fragile and more durable simultaneously, something that could survive the inevitable reversals and defeats and ugly episodes that no family's history was without. He did not understand that the thing that made institutions survive their own worst moments was love. Not love in the simple, private sense, but the broader, more complicated form of it. The attachment of people to a person who had treated them as people, who had remembered their names, who had cared, visibly, and without obvious calculation, about their specific and individual existence. Tyrion generated this quality everywhere he went. Not universally, he was too precise a reader of people to waste this quality on those who would simply use it against him, and there were many such people in his life, but selectively, genuinely, in a way that was not performance because it was not inconsistent with his private behaviour, because when the room was empty and the performance was not required, he was still interested in the person, still curious, still warm in the provisional, defended way that damage tends to produce in people who have not been entirely destroyed by it. The people who served him well remembered it for the rest of their lives. Bronn remembered it. Pod Payne, the squire who attached himself to Tyrion with the specific fidelity of a young person who has found in an unexpected person the quality of genuine attention, remembered it. The men who followed him into the sortie at the Blackwater, on an instruction that was essentially asking them to charge towards certain death on the theory that the alternative was worse, followed him in part because he was one of the few people in a position of authority who looked at them as something other than expendable. Tywin died in the privy, shot with a crossbow by the son he could not see. There is a version of this death that focuses on its indignity. The great lord, the architect of Lannister supremacy, the man whose reputation had held kingdoms in check for 4 decades, dying in the most undignified possible location, in the most personal possible confrontation, at the hands of the person he had most thoroughly failed to understand. And there is another version, equally valid, that focuses on its logic. The man who had never been able to look at Tyrion and see anything other than a problem had, over the course of a lifetime of that particular blindness, created the conditions for exactly this outcome. He had failed to understand that dismissing a person completely, denying them a place, refusing to see them, was not a form of control. It was a form of pressure that accumulated without release until it found one. What Tyrion carried forward from his father's death was not primarily guilt, or if it was guilt of a very complicated kind, mixed with grief of an equally complicated kind, mixed with the long overdue resolution of an argument that had been ongoing for 34 years and had only reached its conclusion because every other form of resolution had been taken away. He carried forward, instead, a question. The question was essentially his father's question, seen from the opposite direction. What does it mean to leave something behind that matters? Tywin had believed the answer was legacy in the institutional sense, the house surviving, the name persisting, the gold continuing to flow and the reputation continuing to hold. Tyrion was no longer certain that this kind of legacy was achievable, or worth the things it cost to pursue it. The question of whether Tyrion loved his family, in the complicated, qualified, genuinely mixed sense that actual love usually operates in rather than the simple, uncomplicated version that the word is often supposed to imply, is one the story answers obliquely rather than directly, which is the honest way to answer it. He loved Jaime. This is unambiguous and consistent across the full record of their interactions, even the interactions where the love was complicated by anger, or disappointment, or the specific grief of a person who loves someone who has made choices they cannot fully defend. The love for Jaime was the oldest thing in him, and the most resilient, the thing that survived everything that happened between them, and continued to exert its influence on his decisions even after the circumstances that might have been expected to end it. He loved his father in a form of the word that requires the word to carry more weight than it usually does. Loved him in the sense of needing his love, needing it with the specific intensity of a person who has never received the thing they needed most, and has spent their entire life in the vicinity of the person who could provide it, hoping. This is not the same as the love that flows freely between people who have been generous with each other and have built a relationship of mutual regard over time. It is something more attenuated and more painful, the love that exists in the potential form rather than the actual form, the love of what might have been rather than what was. He needed Tywin's regard and never received it, and the needing did not diminish with the not receiving, which is perhaps the most terrible thing to say about the relationship, that the absence of what he needed did not cure him of the need. What he built, through the handship and the trial and the crossing and the years of service to Daenerys, was a version of himself that was capable of operating without the validation he had originally required. Not comfortable without it. The comfort was never quite achieved, and the accounts of people who knew him late suggest a man who still carried the original hunger, somewhat less raw but still present, still occasionally visible in the unguarded moments. But capable of doing the work, of making the right assessment, of offering the right counsel, of caring about the right outcomes, even without anyone at the centre of his life telling him that his caring was noticed and valued and would be received. He became capable of proceeding on his own authority, which is to say he became, finally and at considerable cost, something close to free. The irony that the histories tend to miss, the irony that sits at the centre of the whole story, and that Tywin's particular formation prevented him from ever perceiving, is that the family's greatest asset and its most significant failure were the same person. Tyrion Lannister was the thing the Lannister name claimed to represent: the intelligence, the adaptability, the ability to survive and prevail in circumstances that would have destroyed less capable people. And the family could not use him because he had arrived in the wrong vessel, and the family could not receive him because receiving him would have required admitting that the vessel was not the point. The gold was in there all along. The family was looking at the stone. He found, in Daenerys' service, a different possible answer. Not the house, not the name, not the accumulated political architecture of a family's centuries of dominance, but something more immediate and more fragile, the possibility of a kingdom that worked differently. A kingdom where the small folk, the people whose names no history would ever record, whose suffering generated none of the narratives that the great houses wrote about themselves, might occupy a slightly less disastrous position than they had occupied in every kingdom that had preceded it. It was an idealistic idea. He knew it was an idealistic idea. His intelligence was far too comprehensive to allow him the comfort of not knowing how far idealistic ideas typically fell short of their own stated ambitions, when contact with reality applied its characteristic friction. But he held it anyway, with the specific tenacity of a man who has concluded that cynicism, while accurate, is insufficient as a sole operating principle. The question of what Tyrion was smarter than Tywin about is, in the end, not primarily about tactical intelligence or political capability, though in both of those domains his case is strong and, we would argue, conclusive. It is about something deeper, something that sits underneath the tactics and the politics and the wit, and even the extraordinary capacity for reading a room that was his greatest and least celebrated gift. He was smarter about people. Not smarter in the sense of being more analytically capable. Tywin's analytical capability was very high. Smarter in the sense of having a more complete and more accurate model of what people actually were, as opposed to what the story of power required them to be. People, in Tywin's model, were primarily vectors of interest, things that could be motivated or deterred, that could be made to serve or made to desist, that could be used as instruments in the achievement of institutional goals. This model was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. Tyrion's model included the same analytical dimension, and added to it the dimension that his own experience had made impossible to ignore, the dimension of the irreducible personhood of each individual, the specific and non-transferable quality of each human being's inner life, the way that a person's history and damage and desire and fear produced a specific gravity that could not be fully accounted for in any political calculation, however sophisticated. He saw people as people, including the ones it would have been more convenient to see as instruments. This was, depending on which moment in his story you were standing in, either a tremendous strength or a tremendous vulnerability, or both, simultaneously. It is worth sitting with the scale of what he was for a moment, before the final quiet descends. A man born at the cost of the only person who might have received him fully. A man who grew up inside the cold of someone else's unresolved mourning. A man who turned every disadvantage into a form of equipment and every exclusion into a kind of expertise. A man who saved a city and received a scar in return. A man who stood in a courtroom and finally said the thing he had been not saying for 34 years. A man who crossed the ocean with blood on his hands and found, on the other side, a cause worth the cost of caring about it. A man who was, in the deepest sense, the truest heir to the thing the Lannister name claimed to be. Clever, genuinely clever, in the way that costs something, in the way that requires the full expenditure of a person's capacity across a lifetime, and who could never quite be received by the house that made him. The histories of Westeros, such as they are, do not know what to do with Tyrion Lannister. They categorize him variously as a traitor and as a hero, as a monster and as a statesman, as a footnote and as a pivot point, depending on which historian is writing and which political moment is producing the writing. He is all of these things, in different chapters of the same story. He is also, beneath all the categories, simply a person. Complicated, damaged, extraordinary, persistent, warm in the cold places where warmth was still available and capable, right up until the last account we have of him, of the same thing he had always been capable of, the thing that his father could not manage, and his sister could not manage, and the city could not manage, and perhaps the whole kingdom could not manage. He was capable of looking at the situation with clear eyes, and then trying, despite everything, to do the thing that was right rather than the thing that was safe. It did not always work. It worked more often than it should have, given the circumstances. And now the story rests. The stories will be here tomorrow. The histories will keep. The long record of a remarkable man's life will sit in whatever archive the imagination maintains, quiet and patient and available whenever you need to return to it. You do not need to hold any of it tonight. Let it go slowly, the way the last light goes from the sky at the end of a long day, not all at once, but gently, a shade at a time, until the dark is complete and comfortable and entirely your own. Your watch is ended, the fire is banked, the gold threads in the rock have gone dark for the night. And somewhere in the long history of a continent that never quite existed, a small man with mismatched eyes and a sharp mind and a wound at his beginning is, for once, simply resting, the way you are resting now, deeply and without obligation, in the full and quiet dark. If you found this journey worth taking, let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious about that. And if there is a story you would like to drift through next, leave it in the comments, and I will find you there, in the dark, with another candle lit and another archive open and all the time in the world to tell it slowly. Sleep well.